Will he be the last Kansas Senate Democrat? The 1932 United States Senate election in Kansas. Democrat George McGill wins 46% of the vote and narrowly defeats his Republican opponent Benjamin Paulin. This may seem like an insignificant footnote of American political history, and in many ways it is. But the chain of events this minor election set in motion have a lot to tell us about the trends that have shaped American politics over the last century. Because in the 93 years since Paulin fell to McGill, his Republican Party hasn't lost a single Senate election in Kansas. How is that possible, you might ask? Well, generally speaking, Kansas has been among the strongest Republican Party strongholds in the nation for most of its existence. It has voted for the Republican Party candidate in all but 7 presidential elections since its admission to the Union: 1892, 1896, 1912, 1916, 1932, 1936, and 1964. That means Republican Senate candidates have only needed to run ahead of a losing presidential candidate twice since the streak began. The largest chance of the streak snapping was the 1936 Senate election, considering Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats were popular enough to win the state despite the Kansas governor himself being the Republican nominee. However, the incumbent Senator Arthur Capper still managed a 4-point victory. In 1964, Kansas Republicans benefited from a fortuitous election schedule, as neither Senate seat was up for election in a year where Democrat Lyndon Johnson won a crushing landslide presidential victory. But even knowing Kansas's heavily Republican voting record doesn't fully explain the 93-year streak. That's because, though the dominance of the Democratic and Republican parties has existed for about as long as Kansas itself, the values and policies of these parties have not stayed constant, changing with the time period and its specific issues. As such, political scientists have split American political history into 7 party systems. The Republicans' Senate winning streak falls into the 5th, 6th, and 7th party systems. Let's explore how they managed to keep their grip on power amidst each political realignment. In order to understand the appeal of Republicans in Kansas in each party system, it's critical to understand who is voting in Kansas. Throughout the 93 years we are covering, Kansas has been a primarily white working-class state. It currently ranks number 7 among all the states in labor force participation and is 75% white, though that number has trended down fairly recently. The state was more than 90% white for most of the 20th century. Therefore, it is the political leanings of the white working-class demographic that have determined the political direction of the state. The 5th party system, characterized by the policies of Franklin Roosevelt, involvement in World War II, America's rise to global superpower, civil rights, and the dominance of the Democratic Party, lasted from 1932 until 1968. That encompasses the very beginning of the streak, as well as the election in which circumstances made it most likely to break. Initially, Kansans were very supportive of Roosevelt, and voted for him in 1932 and 1936, as I mentioned before. Though surprising on the surface, Republican Senator Arthur Capper's aforementioned concurrent 1936 victory can probably be attributed to his support for many of Roosevelt's popular policies. White working-class voters were the backbone of the New Deal coalition, which buoyed the Democratic Party's success during this era. However, those same voters began to exit the coalition in the later stages of the 5th party system. White voters slipped to only 41% support for Democrats by 1956, as did voters with a high school education level, which most of the working class did, to 42%. Even though there was no constant decline and averaging out a couple elections in a row would return support levels closer to 50% in both categories, it still represented a drop-off from Roosevelt's landslides. This is how the Republican streak survived the most pro-Democrat party system. The 6th party system, characterized by de-alignment in which no party maintained a long-term grip on power rivaling the Democrats of the previous system, lasted from 1968 until 2016. The aforementioned disintegration of the New Deal coalition slowed in the very late 5th system and early 6th system until the era of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan between 1976 and 1980. That's when white voters without college degrees shifted more than 5 points to the right, beginning a trend that would last until the present day. Even when Democrats stormed back to power under Bill Clinton, their new, more business-friendly image contrasted with that of Roosevelt, and failed to stop Kansas's majority group from shifting another 10 points to the right from 1988 to 2016. Though the 90s is also around when white voters began to lose influence in Kansas, dropping from 90% of the population in 1990 to somewhere around 80% in 2016, that was offset by the magnitude of the rightward shift. This period essentially cemented Kansas's shift to the Republican Party and made it very difficult for a Democrat to break the Senate streak. The seventh party system, characterized by the full realignment of the working class coalition to the Republican Party, started in 2016 with the rise of Donald Trump, although it is still debated whether this period is distinct from the sixth system. During Trump's first term, white voters without college degrees shifted another 5 points to the right, with a new total of 55% supporting Republicans at the start of the decade compared to under 35% at the end of the fifth party system. Though minority populations are still rising across the country, Kansas remains 75% white, meaning it would likely take at least 3 decades or more for white working class voters to lose what currently amounts to almost sole influence over the outcome of elections in the state. What that means is that in the seventh party system, Republicans seem all but certain to maintain control of Kansas. The 93 years of Republican dominance in Kansas Senate elections are representative of many discussions taking place right now in modern politics. Kansas is ground zero for the demise of the New Deal coalition, for disillusionment with the modern Democratic Party, for the Republican Party's success in attracting working class support. While one may look at the numbers of Kansas's elections, see they have a 2-term Democrat governor, see margins under 10 points in Democrats' elusive chase for a Senate victory, and think that a shift is inevitable sooner or later, that idea contradicts with everything we know about Kansas politics. Because in Kansas, the white working class holds the keys to power, and they aren't likely to give them to Democrats running for Senate until the next FDR-esque alignment. The 93 years will march on.